Before I begin, I want you to imagine a moment in financial history that everyone sees, yet no one understands. A moment when people think they are witnessing a simple market trend, a price movement, or another wave of speculation rising and falling like any other. But hidden beneath the noise, behind the emotions, buried under headlines and social commentary, there is a structural shift taking place so quietly that only a handful of analysts are even aware of what they're looking at. They believe it is just another phase, another hype cycle, another token riding the optimism of digital finance. They think this is the old story repeating itself. But what if I told you that what is about to happen with XRP in 2026 is not another cycle, not another bubble, not another rally fueled by trends, but the consequence of something that has been building for a decade? What if the real shift isn't in price at all, but in the architecture of global money? If that sounds like exaggeration, then that is precisely the problem. The biggest transformations in financial history rarely look like revolution. They begin as inefficiencies, experiments, and maybe one day, technologies. Then suddenly, they become central infrastructure. As I look at the data, it reminds me of every misunderstood money transition we've ever lived through. The stock market that nobody believed would outgrow bonds. The internet that nobody thought would replace paper billing. The credit card era that was initially dismissed as unnecessary because cash already works. In each case, the established system succeeded so well that people couldn't imagine a replacement. The same psychological bias is occurring today with global finance. Most people think the existing banking framework works perfectly fine. Yes, it's slow, yes, it's expensive, and yes, it's fragmented, but it seems to function. And that illusion of function is exactly why the change is coming. XRP is not competing against failure. It is competing against inefficiency. And inefficiency has always been the deadliest vulnerability in financial systems, especially when exposed to new technology. I don't look at XRP as a cryptocurrency first. I look at it the same way I would look at a long-term commodity that supports large-scale economic activity. Just as crude oil became valuable not because people admired the substance, but because the world needed energy infrastructure. Just as gold remained valuable not because it was shiny, but because it served as a reliable store of value across borders. Just as electrical copper became an irreplaceable industrial backbone. XRP, to me, is more in that category. It is a settlement infrastructure. Most people see it as a currency hoping for appreciation. They watch charts expecting speculation to do the heavy lifting. They miss the point. The point isn't speculation. The point is demand from institutions that are forced to solve problems with speed, liquidity, and interoperability because the old system simply cannot scale with global financial data, instant transfers, and the acceleration of capital flows. When most people look at XRP, they see a coin. They see price charts, speculation, influencers shouting predictions, and traders looking for the next surge. But that is the same mistake markets always make when they judge a new financial tool through the lens of old habits. They look at something disruptive and assume it must behave like everything they already know. They assume that because previous cryptocurrencies moved on hype, XRP must do the same. They assume that because Bitcoin or memecoins rise and fall on emotion, XRP is bound to follow the identical pattern. They see volatility, and they think the asset belongs to the same category of speculation. That surface-level assumption is exactly why most investors misunderstand it. I look at XRP not as a bet on price, but as a core piece of infrastructure, similar to how energy powers economies, not markets. We don't buy oil because we love the commodity. We don't build copper demand because we collect it like gold. These assets became valuable because they support the mechanics of civilization. Oil powers transportation, manufacturing, military logistics. Copper powers electricity. Gold historically powered monetary confidence and cross-border trust. These things were not adopted because they were exciting. They were adopted because no system could scale without them. The same logic applies to digital liquidity. Most cryptocurrencies are built to be held, speculated on, traded for profit. Their value is tied to scarcity and sentiment, XRP is not designed to be hoarded for identity or ideology. It is a settlement instrument. Its purpose is movement. It exists to solve a problem that has been growing for decades: the slow, rigid, expensive settlement architecture that underpins global finance. Banks move money through fractured channels, with each channel requiring reserves to be locked up as collateral. This creates dead capital. Imagine trillions sitting idle simply to allow a transaction to settle. That is equivalent to storing tons of gasoline in locked warehouses and never burning it to run engines. The system is wasteful. When a system is wasteful, the solution that reduces waste becomes indispensable. XRP reduces the waste by transforming liquidity from something static into something reusable. Instead of locking reserves at every banking endpoint, a neutral settlement layer can move liquidity instantly without trapping it. That is not speculation, that is infrastructure. It is not glamorous, it is foundational. Infrastructure rarely fascinates the public, but it always controls the backbone of value. The internet did not become essential because people speculated on routers. Railroads didn't reshape countries because their steel tracks were collectible. They became essential because economies could not expand without them. XRP does not need a cult following or community rallies to justify itself. If it solves the inefficiency of global settlement, demand will come from the institutions that need it to scale their operations. The irony is that speculation distracts people from seeing the very thing that gives XRP long-term importance. They measure it like a gambler measures a betting token. Buy low, sell high, predict peaks, predict dips. That approach misses its purpose entirely. XRP isn't trying to win popularity contests in crypto. It is trying to win efficiency contests in international finance. And efficiency is always adopted eventually, not because the masses demand it, but because the system cannot survive without it. That is why I don't watch XRP like a trader. I watch it like someone studying the pipes of a future monetary network. If those pipes turn out to be necessary, the market won't need hype to value them. It will need them to function. And when something becomes necessary, value is not a theory, it is a consequence. When people talk about the global banking system, they usually focus on what appears functional. They see ATMs dispensing cash, debit cards processing payments, banks sending transfers, and wire payments arriving after a few days. They look at this slow machinery and think, well, it works. That illusion of functionality is exactly how failing systems survive longer than they should. A decaying financial system doesn't collapse because it's visibly broken. It collapses because it is silently inefficient. It bleeds value in places no one notices. It wastes time, capital, and liquidity on processes that could be solved in seconds. The banking world is filled with inefficiencies, so normalized that people treat them as permanent features. A 3-day settlement window, fees for sending money across borders, reserve requirements that lock trillions in idle capital. The system makes these inefficiencies seem reasonable, as if they exist to make things safe, when in reality they exist to cover the weakness of outdated plumbing. What most people call fees are not arbitrary charges. They are symptoms of a broken architecture. Every time a bank charges you more to send money across borders, it is passing the cost of slow, fragmented settlement onto you. Every delay you experience is not a technical issue, it is a structural limitation. And beneath those limitations is a rotting foundation capital that cannot move freely. Trillions of dollars are trapped in Nostro and Vostro accounts around the world, just so banks can settle payments that should take seconds. This trapped liquidity is economic waste. In an era where governments borrow aggressively, where inflation eats purchasing power faster than wages rise, where global trade becomes digital and instantaneous, locking capital in dormant accounts is not just inefficient, it is dangerous. The global economy depends on liquidity velocity. Capital needs to move faster today than at any time in financial history. When capital is trapped, governments print more money to solve short-term pressure, creating debt cycles and inflation spirals. Corporations borrow more instead of accessing their own cash because that cash is stuck in settlement pipelines. Banks absorb losses from slow-moving balances and the cost trickles down to every consumer and business. In other words, the outdated settlement system doesn't just slow money, it distorts entire economies. It raises prices, increases debt, and strains global trade. That distortion is not sustainable. When inefficiency becomes unbearable, technology always replaces it. Not because people want change, but because the system cannot function otherwise. The shift toward instant settlement is not a trend, it is a requirement. Governments, corporations, and financial networks are being forced towards speed, not willingly, but economically. A system where trillions are immobilized cannot survive an era where trillions need to circulate instantly. The financial world is reaching a breaking point, and XRP becomes relevant not as an experiment, but as a solution engineered exactly for this structural failure. It is not here to compete with digital coins being traded like collectibles. It is here to compete with a banking system that is incapable of scaling with modern demands. The tragedy is that most investors still look at XRP through the lens of speculation. They expect emotional price swings to determine its value, while the real value is quietly forming underneath, inside the pressure points of global finance. The system's inefficiency is no longer tolerable. As instant settlement becomes mandatory for survival, the old architecture will be replaced. XRP is not trying to disrupt finance. It is stepping into a role finance cannot fill without it. And when a system needs something to stay alive, adoption becomes inevitable. That is why the failing settlement infrastructure matters. Not because it is collapsing loudly, but because it is collapsing quietly. And solutions that remove friction will become the backbone of the next economy. Liquidity is not about how much money exists. It's about how quickly that money can move. Most people assume value in finance comes from storing capital, like stacking piles of cash in a vault or holding reserves in a bank account. They think safety is measured by how much you possess, not how efficiently you can deploy it. That is a misconception inherited from older economic systems, systems where value was static, slow, and physically constrained. Today, however, money is data. It moves across networks and borders at digital speed. At least, it should. The problem is that our settlement architecture was built for a slower world. It forces liquidity to freeze every time a payment crosses jurisdictions. Money doesn't really move. It gets paused, verified, reconciled, and only then released. While the payment waits, capital sits lifeless. This delay is expensive. Every second capital is frozen, value decays, alternatives are borrowed, and institutions suffer opportunity costs. Liquidity becomes trapped by design. XRP introduces something fundamentally different: liquidity that doesn't have to wait. Instead of locking reserves on both sides of a transaction, one unit of XRP can move repeatedly through a network in rapid succession. It does not stay idle. It doesn't need to be tied up as collateral. It can be passed through multiple settlement events within minutes, acting like a clean, circulating settlement engine. This concept is more revolutionary than most investors realize. Traditional liquidity is like water trapped behind dams, released only after long procedures. XRP functions more like continuously flowing water powering multiple turbines. The same liquidity unit can generate value over and over again within a short time frame. In a global settlement system, that kind of repeated utility is rare. It means banks no longer need to immobilize trillions just to facilitate movement. It means capital can finally behave like capital, active, fluid, and productive. Most cryptocurrencies do not do this. They are built to be held, hoarded, or speculated on. They are not designed to turn velocity into value. A speculative token wants to be scarce. XRP wants to be used. In speculative markets, scarcity drives price because the goal is to limit supply and increase demand through emotion. But utility economies are the opposite. Accessibility and reliability create demand because the network needs liquidity available at any given moment. That is why infrastructure assets, oil, copper, electricity, do not collapse in value because they are abundant. Their abundance makes their usage scalable. XRP works the same way. It is valuable not despite its circulation, but because of it. The traditional financial framework makes liquidity sit still like passengers waiting for delayed flights. These delays cost nations billions. Businesses borrow money they already possess simply because that money is sitting in transit like an idle traveler. XRP replaces those delays with instant settlement, turning passengers into nonstop commuters. That speed is more than convenience. It prevents the economic distortions caused by immobility. It reduces the need for massive reserves. It eliminates the silent cost of locked capital. It removes layers of friction that banks have spent decades normalizing. People underestimate how transformative reusable liquidity is. They treat XRP like a speculative asset waiting for a big price breakout. They expect volatility to determine its worth. But volatility only matters to traders. Institutions care about reliability, speed, and cost reduction. XRP is not trying to win over speculators. It is trying to solve the problem of dead capital. And dead capital is one of the biggest weaknesses in global finance. When you turn locked reserves into active, reusable liquidity, you don't create speculation. You create efficiency. Efficiency, historically, always wins. It just doesn't advertise itself. This is why XRP's true value will not reveal itself in hype cycles. It will reveal itself in utility cycles, where velocity becomes a feature, not an afterthought. The market will eventually recognize that liquidity is not valuable when it sits still. It is valuable when it moves. XRP is built to move. And when movement becomes the foundation of global settlement, the asset designed for velocity becomes indispensable. People imagine major financial change as something dramatic, chaotic, and publicly celebrated, like a sudden market explosion or a headline announcing a revolution. That is how hype-driven assets behave. Speculative markets want applause before results. But true transformation in finance never announces itself loudly. It happens quietly, through structural adoption. It enters the system the same way electricity replaced candles, not through public excitement, but through necessity. The evolution of settlement infrastructure will follow that same path. When people demand results, they reveal that they are thinking like traders, not analysts. This is why they misunderstand the timeline. XRP will not become globally relevant through a sudden price shock or a viral moment. It will become relevant when banks, institutions, and governments begin using it without asking permission from the market. Adoption will not look like hype. It will look like integration. The year 2026 matters not because of sentiment, but because of structural shift. Regulations, digital currency frameworks, liquidity shortages, and modernization strategies are converging. No institution wants to operate in the shadows of unregulated payment tools, and no large-scale economy can survive with slow, friction-heavy cross-border settlements. This combination forces systems to adopt instant settlement layers, not because they want to upgrade, but because they cannot scale without upgrading. When the system reaches a point where inefficiency becomes unbearable, adoption becomes mandatory. What most investors expect from 2026 is a market breakout. What they should be watching instead is infrastructure deployment. Institutions don't wake up one day and suddenly move trillions through a new network. They test, they integrate, they phase in. They switch from trial usage to operational usage quietly. Those integration phases are invisible to the trader, who only cares about chart patterns. But they are highly visible to the analyst who studies settlement technology as a foundation, not a lottery ticket. In the beginning stages of adoption, the market barely reacts. It doesn't know how to price infrastructure because it keeps trying to price it like speculation. That confusion creates mispricing. Mispricing is opportunity. In 2026, XRP will not be screaming for attention. It will be embedded where attention cannot see it. It will be inside payment corridors, cross-border frameworks, compliance systems, and liquidity automation. The asset's relevance won't be defined by individual investors holding it. It will be defined by institutions moving through it. The irony is that by the time the market realizes value has been accumulating through usage, the speculation-driven investors will think they missed the breakout, but the breakout won't actually be a breakout at all. It will be the slow reveal that XRP has already become infrastructure. When history looks back at transformations, it notices the moment when things clearly changed. But it forgets the years when that change was quietly implemented. Recessions don't begin when markets crash, they begin months before the crash, in data that most investors ignore. Major monetary shifts don't begin when politicians announce them. They begin in technical policy drafts, negotiated behind closed doors. Infrastructure adoption works the same way. The groundwork is slow, the switch is sudden. Investors mistake the sudden switch as the opportunity, when the real opportunity was the period when no one cared. 2026 is part of that period. Not an explosion. A build-up. Speculative minds miss this because they expect noise. But noise is entertainment, not insight. Real transformation doesn't ask for attention, and price follows function, not excitement. When settlement systems quietly begin relying on XRP for efficiency, markets will be forced to recognize its role after the fact. By then, adoption will already be underway. When something becomes infrastructure, it doesn't need hype to gain value, it needs time. And time, combined with necessity, is the most unstoppable force in finance. Speculative markets always reward noise over logic. They push prices based on emotion, not on structure. People chase the next explosion, the next rally, the next high, as if markets exist to entertain them. In this environment, most crypto investors treat assets like lottery tickets rather than tools. They reward hype cycles and assume value rises because people talk about it. The irony is that the most transformative financial assets rarely behave this way. Infrastructure doesn't need applause to function. It doesn't need a community cheerleading for price action. It becomes valuable because the system depends on it. XRP will eventually be priced not by the enthusiasm of traders, but by the scale of institutions using it to solve problems. That shift from speculation to utilization is hard for the market to understand. Price will eventually stop reflecting mood swings and will begin reflecting actual usage. When something becomes a core part of global settlement, its worth becomes a mathematical consequence, not a speculative dream. Speculative assets rise and fall based on attention, and when attention fades, so does price. But XRP's purpose isn't to impress traders. It is to reduce friction in cross-border movements, lower settlement costs, improve liquidity velocity, and remove the need for frozen capital reserves. Those functions are not temporary, and they are not dependent on retail traders holding tokens. They are dependent on institutions needing efficiency. And efficiency is not optional. It is a requirement for modern markets. Once the infrastructure relies on XRP to operate, value becomes tied to system integrity. When a network becomes a settlement backbone, its removal becomes costly. At that point, price does not respond to hype, but to demand generated by real activity. That demand is stable, repeatable, and measurable. Retail investors misunderstand this progression because they are conditioned to believe that value comes from scarcity and hype, rather than function. They watch tokens with no utility soar because of memes or celebrity endorsements, and assume this is the path to wealth. But these assets succeed only as long as sentiment carries them. They don't survive when sentiment disappears. They behave like fashion trends. When the hype cycle ends, they fade into irrelevance. XRP is built for a completely different economic environment. It doesn't require loyalty from traders. It requires necessity from institutions. And necessity beats sentiment every time. When a system needs a tool to work efficiently, it doesn't matter if the market finds it boring. It will be used. Price discovery for infrastructure happens backwards. It isn't driven by anticipation. It is driven by adoption that already occurred. The market always recognizes it late. Railroads, electricity, the early internet, these were all underpriced for years because no one knew how to value them until society depended on them. The same pattern applies to decentralized settlement infrastructure. Investors are waiting for hype to justify price, while the real justification is being quietly built behind the scenes. Price will eventually reflect utility, not narratives. And when price reflects utility, the value becomes less volatile, less speculative, and more structurally anchored. This is why the idea of XRP taking off like a meme token is misguided. It will not move like a speculative asset when true adoption arrives. It will behave more like a foundational resource, priced according to demand for liquidity and transaction volume, not excitement. Many investors will actually be disappointed, not because XRP fails, but because it succeeds in the wrong way for their expectations. They want an explosion. They will get stability. They want a sudden moonshot. They will get measured growth driven by actual usage. But in finance, stability is where real wealth is built. Hype creates spikes and crashes. Utility creates recurring value. The market will eventually stop treating XRP like a gamble and begin valuing it like infrastructure. And when that happens, the price will no longer be a story people speculate about. It will be a consequence of the system that relies on it.